Now, I have no idea what my area of expertise is. Before I went to the coordinating board, I spent a lot of time in community colleges and started as an adjunct and ended as a VP for instruction. And all of my degrees are in political science, and I must admit that this year has been one of those where I almost wished I was back in the classroom, because this has been like no other in the, well, I haven't seen anything like this probably since the 1820s when Andrew Jackson was running for president. But anyway, but whatever expertise I have, I sort of picked up as I went along, I guess.
Good afternoon, everybody. After that great lunch, y'all have to stay awake now, right? Okay. It was interesting what he said. I don't know the area expertise. In the service center world, you kind of just go into whatever it is they need for the day sometimes, and then you grow in that. So I started as a CTE consultant at the service center, and that evolved. Right after I arrived at the service centers, when we were allowed to witness the rollout of House Bill 5. And so I came into that role, and so I've developed with counselors and teachers the role in entertaining and developing the rollout for House Bill 5 with high schools and middle schools. So for the last 2 years, that has really been my focus, and then I moved into accountability and assessment as well.
Okay. Goodness, in terms of an area of expertise, I guess. For me, when I first started working in academic advising, they hired me to work with students that didn't have a major. And they had a half-hour training session that said, you're going to help the ones that don't have a major. And that was about it. So I spent probably the better part of I don't know how many years reading up and learning and trying things and failing miserably and finding out what worked and didn't work in terms of working with students who don't know what they want to do, which is really probably most of them, including the ones that pick something and then change their mind later. So I would say that's probably what I would say is my area of expertise.
So my background is actually a bit diverse. I was the Dean of Math and Sciences at Brookhaven College for a number of years, and then became the Dean of Educational Partnerships before moving on to the position that I have now. And in that role of educational partnerships, I worked with our early college high school that we have on our campus, dual credit students for a variety of districts, public and private, and university transfer. So it gave me a great opportunity to see that pathway from high school to community college to university for students really in underrepresented groups that needed the most help. And now I'm able to work in that arena as one of the projects that I have at the district level for the Dallas County Community College District. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but I think my expertise is in working with students along that pathway and now at a system level to be able to do that. And guided pathways is one of the solutions, one of the approaches that will help those students.
All right, well, thank y'all. So the first thing we kind of wanted to talk about was what are some of the critical issues that all of you guys see in your everyday workforce facing students?
Start here again?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll just
Yeah, we should do the wave thing. Well, I think there are a couple of major issues that face students. I think, first of all, students increasingly are faced with the sometimes daunting task of how to pay for college without incurring a lot of debt along the way, and the implications that has for how it drives their own career choices. So we see more and more students picking their majors based on what they think they're going to be able to earn with them. And so I think that's a major issue that we haven't really confronted much in the past in terms of particularly advising and counseling. And I think another big issue that students face is the transfer issue. In Texas, over half of our students start at a community college, and we have a whole bunch of others that start at a 4-year and then go to a 2-year and then go to another 4-year, or they're going to 2 4-years and a 2-year at the same time, or they start, at a 4-year and go to a 4-year and drop out and then come back to a 2-year and then go to a 4-year. And all along the way, they're taking classes, and how does all that, at some point, then add up to a degree of some sort? So I think they face a lot of issues that deal with transfer. And I'll leave it at that for now.
I think that can everyone hear me okay? I think that
In the back, it's, we'll talk a little.
Bring it closer.
Is that better? Is that better? No. Instead of passing it back and forth? Okay, it actually comes off. One of the things that I see, I guess, is obviously student-driven, because now with how we're working at the secondary level is we're asking 8th graders to come in and choose an endorsement. So I think the biggest thing that I see is that, okay, so how do I choose that? Where do I start? So everything falls down to now elementary school. So we have elementary counselors that we have to engage in the conversation. So it's not about, I'm going to choose a career for the rest of my life. It's about, I'm going to choose something that I'm interested in so that I can stay in school. And also, what am I gaining along the way? Because those transferable skills is really what we're after. It's not about, I'm going to be an engineer forever for the rest of my life, or I'm going to go be a doctor. It's about what skills am I gaining. That's a hard conversation to have with a 5th grader or a 3rd grader, and even with an 8th grader, And then that goes even back down to now we're looking at how we deal with parents. Because really at that age, parents control what the student chooses to a degree. And so really how are we looking at parental education is really, so those are kind of the 2 pieces I see paramount with K-12.
So I guess I think about the challenges that we deal with in advising, and as similar to what we would say just generally higher ed is dealing with, and I try to use the same letter to remember them all. So, you talked about earlier some of these pieces, but that access to higher ed, what does that really mean, right? And that can be something where sometimes, depending upon where they went to K through 12, that's a different, they may be getting access to higher ed, but they're not getting access to the same things. And I think we're on the front lines of having to deal with what that really means when students sit in our office. So I think access is part of it. I think affordability is part of it. Accountability is part of it. And that hasn't been something we've had to pay as much attention to in higher ed until fairly recently, is that accountability piece. Academic preparation, right? That college readiness piece. And then I think the last piece that we don't always talk about is, but we play an integral role in their adjustment when they come to our environments, right? And this is particularly becoming more and more important with changing demographics in this state, where you have a lot more students who are first generation coming from places where their parents don't understand what higher ed is or what the experience is, which makes what you were just describing even more challenging, right? How do you tell a 5th grader of a first generation parent, that's going to be a first generation college student hopefully, about these kind of choices?
So to add on to what has already been said, I think another critical issue, and David alluded to, a lot of the work that we do with our younger students in dual credit in our early college high school programs is that college readiness preparation, because they are indeed college students at a very young age. But there's another piece that I think is challenging, and that is the social responsibility and adaptation, because a lot of what we do in an effort, in a true, genuine effort for them to be successful, is we do a lot for them. And so it sometimes is difficult when they transition to university and they've not been empowered to do for themselves, and there are some difficulties. And I know that many of our local universities have great programs, some designed specifically for the dual credit student that's coming in, some designed specifically for transfer students, but oftentimes those are voluntary. And so it's difficult for a student to know where to go and to navigate. So a critical component along with access and affordability is preparing the student and empowering them to navigate for themselves so that they don't waste the wonderful opportunity given to them up to the point where they reach the university and then are lost and don't have someone to go to.
Right, thank y'all. So two of the major topics that we kind of wanted to specifically address today are going to be Texas House Bill 5 and 60 by 30. So we're going to start with House Bill 5. So we already know who's going to answer the first question. So for those of us that are unfamiliar with House Bill 5, can you kind of explain this piece of legislation, its goals, how long it's been implemented, and particularly endorsements?
Okay, how many of you are from the high school setting? Okay. All right, so really what this is about is, I've heard it in a couple of sessions this morning regarding the skills gap in certain areas, and are we really producing post-secondary ready students? What does that look like? We have workforce needs, industry needs, so they came to the table and said, what are we going to do about it? Kind of how I came to this table, because through CTE, we've been developing those patterns for a long time. Coherent sequences, but there hasn't been a real stronghold to say you have to have these courses. Students could take intro courses for 4 years. So now with House Bill 5 and the endorsements, we're saying stick with one. Because of the value of, like I said earlier, about the transferability of skill sets, I'm not just learning intro skill levels. By sticking with a coherent sequence, I now am gaining skills and hopefully maybe an internship or an externship, job shadowing at minimum for those students. So by pursuing a coherent sequence of courses, we're now developing that skill set that perhaps could lead to certification. It's not required, but that's the goal, because as we know, all of us sitting in this room, a certification can lead to a great career and a great job and a great life, really. So that kind of where that led to create the endorsements. So there's 5 endorsement areas. A student that is now graduating, we could say House Bill 5, but that's what we refer to as the Foundation High School program with an endorsement. So prior it was recommended, right? You can graduate on the recommended plan or the distinguished plan. Now we have Foundation High School program with an endorsement. So that endorsement can be in one of 5 areas. Arts and humanities, let me see if I can, it's only 5, surely I can remember them. STEM, business and industry, public service, and multidisciplinary. So a student can come out with those. And really the goal is, if we can get them a certification on the way, and it's appropriate for that student, certainly that would be a good choice, then I can move on and get stackable credentials. Or move on, and we talked about paying earlier, you mentioned that. How am I going to pay for school? Well, if I can get a certification from an endorsement area, then I'm more likely maybe to go on to the next level and at least have a way to pay for school. So that's a requirement, kind of like mid-level. So we have foundation program only, plus an endorsement, and then you can add distinguished level of achievement to that.
So can you address the K through 12 counselor's role in this?
Yeah, it's huge, if you can imagine, because part of the House Bill 5 was, as I mentioned earlier, we're asking 8th graders to choose an endorsement area. So they're walking out of 8th grade and saying, I want to do STEM, excuse me, or I want to go into public service. So I'm depending, like you said earlier, David, what exposure I have depends on the district I am. What options or pathways I have depends on the district I'm in. So I'm going to choose depending on that, and then I'm going to, as an 8th grader, I'm going to make that choice. And one of the state requirements is by the end of the freshman year, they will sign oh my goodness, went right out of my head. Thank you, a graduation plan. My gosh, 4-year, it's in CTU, it's always a 4-year plan. A personal graduation plan, thank you. So they sign this with their parent by the end of their freshman year that outlines what endorsement they're in, the courses that they will take. So my reference to what has to happen before they get into 8th grade is kind of where that's coming from. So So an 8th grader, I'm choosing that, and then we're talking about, we have kiddos that are coming, or students that are coming into college or leaving high school and really don't know what they want to do, and now we're asking an 8th grader. And that's kind of the parental piece I was talking about, because telling them that this is not necessarily the choice for the rest of their life, this is an opportunity. Think, how many of you started with the same major that you ended up with? A couple? I switched, and it cost me at least a semester and a lot of money. Probably an extra semester. So one of the things we try to tell them is, we want you to be exposed. We want you to expose, and for free, we're going to expose you to this. So those are the kind of things, conversations that we're trying to have, because it was a panic moment when you're dealing with 8th grade and you're asking them to choose. And then parents are like, well, how do they know what they want to do? They're in 8th grade. So those are the kind of where, and the counselor's role is one-to-one guidance. So if you can imagine, when you just filled out a sheet, now I'm choosing an endorsement. So the importance of that guidance prior to 8th grade, and as they're going through, looking at their graduation plan every year. So the role of the counselor has increased tremendously.
Thank you. So kind of opening this up to all panelists, what does House Bill 5 mean for the relationship between K through 12 schools and then higher education institutions?
For the community college, I think what that means is for us to think more purposefully and more aligned as we look at our students coming into the college. So as we're offering dual credit programs, we need to not only be aware of what the endorsements are for a particular high school, for a particular school district, and offer those type of dual credit programs that match those endorsement possibilities. So not only can a student be on an endorsement path and a graduation plan, but earn dual credit courses towards a certificate while they're also within that endorsement. That allows a student then to have those extra benefits, the performance acknowledgments and those added features to their graduation diploma from high school, and possibly earn a credential, a college credential. So that's on the dual credit, general dual credit piece. Another thing, as we are developing more and more early college high schools, many of those early college high schools are career and technical schools. So the expectation not only is that students are on a particular endorsement path, but that they are going to particularly earn certificate or an applied an AAS degree before they even finish high school. So if we're going to make that type of commitment of offering to our students, we have to be very aware of what the endorsements are, what comprises an endorsement, so that we not only give the student an opportunity for this college experience and college credential, but create a pathway, a 4-year plan, a graduation plan that aligns, benefits a student for high school graduation requirements as well as college. So there's a lot in play, and the community college is now more accountable, more responsible to addressing that, rather than just offering a menu of many choices. Because as we know, as you narrow those choices and provide guidance, the student is going to be more successful.
Thank you.
Just one comment about that. I think that for, at a statewide level, it has a lot of implications for what the definition of college readiness and career readiness really means. The college and career readiness standards that were developed 7 or 8 years ago or so were really built around the recommended plan, or what has been also called 4x4. And so the essential idea was that if you went through the 4x4 or the recommended plan, then you could, those college readiness standards and career readiness standards would be embedded in that curriculum, and they were. And so then that would then make you college and career ready. And House Bill 5 kind of stands that on its head, because the foundation plan, the distinguished plan, is the old 4x4 in many respects, but the foundation plan is not. And so there's been a lot of courses added to accommodate the endorsements that were not necessarily a part of the previously existing curriculum. And so part of what's going to have to happen, I think, is that we're going to need to take another look at the college and career readiness standards and where do those fit, and also even ask ourselves whether it makes any sense to have college and career readiness standards, or we should have college readiness standards or career readiness standards, so to speak. And part of this is driven by a conversation that I had a couple of weeks ago with folks from the PTAC Advisory Committee who were fairly adamant about the fact that they didn't care about people being college ready. They didn't need that for their jobs that they were particularly interested in. But on the other hand, most of the time when they talk about, if you say to them that a student needs to be college ready, for them what that means is somebody who's going to go to a four-year school and get a bachelor's degree at a minimum. And it doesn't really occur to them that there are also college level certificates and associate of applied science degrees that they may be interested in or may not be. And so once that was pointed out, but it was like, well, okay, but there was still this sense of, well, we don't need any of that. And we just need people ready to go to work. So I think part of what we're going to have to do going forward then is sort out what college readiness means. And my fear with this is that if we push more and more of this further down, I'm older than 8th grade, and I've only recently sort of figured out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, and that's retire. More and more that's what I think about, and I may have finally figured out what my career goal is. And so, and 8th graders are not well equipped, and it's unclear to me how well equipped parents are. And I am one, okay, and to determine what my 8th graders should be doing. And so I think we just need to be careful about this and make sure that we don't close the options for students. And we could easily do that if we're not, if we don't pay a lot of attention to how we go forward with this.
Can I add one more thing? You asked me earlier about the role of the K-12 counselor, and I think what you guys have set up here, just to reiterate, if you can hear what he said and go back to, you're talking about early college, high school, and as an 8th grader, determining we start that as a freshman, and really looking at the counselor's role in that I have to determine if my 8th grade student is ready to take dual credit. Are they ready to start this? Because once I have dual credit and it's on my transcript, what now? So a lot of, like you said, first generation don't realize what that really means or the implications of that. And also the students don't. And so it's really difficult. That's the role that the counselor now has. It's not only am I going to help them decide what they want to be, which we've done that in the past anyway, what do you want to be when you grow up? But now I'm going to start determining that pathway, and is that student really ready to proceed? And so that's a huge role I see the counselors are going to have to play now.
So I want to shift this a little bit and say, so how does that affect those of you that are academic advisors at whether it's a community college or a four-year institution or another type of higher institution? What this really means is something that we probably should be focusing on regardless of the changes that happen in our states in terms of legislation, in terms of policy. We need to be aware of these things that you're hearing about. But a big part of what you're going to find that you end up doing, and hopefully you're already doing this, regardless of if you're in a department advising a particular set of majors or a major, or you're not in that particular department, and you're more in an office, for instance, where I work, where nobody has a major, you're going to find that a lot of your initial conversations are to either confirm, revise, or reject that choice that they made up until the point they got to your office. That's going to be a big part of how you assist students on the front end when they get to your institutions, so that they actually make well-informed choices about their educational plans and how that might lead to potential life plans in a way that hopefully minimizes cost, time, because those are obviously issues we're worried about right now, right? We want to get everybody out on time. So that's where I think your role is going to be hugely important, is that first question you ask that student after you get to know them a little bit is, so why are you interested in that? Tell me about how you came to that conclusion. What are the experiences and things that you've had that led to you saying, yep, this is why I want to do what I want to do? And the reason that's going to happen is I can tell you nationally, 3 out of every 4 students that comes into higher ed changes their mind. So you're going to spend a lot of time helping students figure out whether or not that choice was really what they wanted.
Okay, so we'll kind of skip down, kind of building off of that. What are the other implications for us in the academic advising role?
So I'm a firm believer in something, this is probably going to oversimplify it, right? I believe that the most simple answer is sometimes the best answer, and we sometimes overcomplicate what we do in advising and overcomplicate what we do in higher ed. So I would say it affects us, but it also doesn't on some level, and I was talking at the table at lunch about this. When that student's sitting in your office, how you have a conversation with them one-on-one, it doesn't change regardless of institutional policy or state legislation or those kinds of things, because it's all about helping that student learn who they are, what's important to them, what they're good at, what they're not so good at, finding out what they're interested in so they can navigate their way through your institutions and hopefully into something afterwards that they love. So I would say it affects it, but on the most basic level, what we do isn't affected by all those changes if we're already doing what an advisor is supposed to be doing. And there are a lot of you that probably know of a coworker that's not doing all the things that an advisor should be doing, right? But hopefully we can get there as a field.
And if I might add to that, I think it builds the students' confidence if you have some knowledge and, I should say, acknowledgement and recognition of the work they've done up to the point where they are in your office. So if they're coming in as a freshman and they just graduated from high school and you know they went to such and such high school and they tell you, I did this endorsement, if you recognize and acknowledge that starts the conversation much more open and saying, oh, I have no idea what you're talking about. So I think in that sense, having that and recognizing the student's accomplishment to that point, I think makes a big difference.
I know one thing you guys kind of started to touch on are what are some of the expected implications for House Bill 5 for students as they transition into the higher education setting?
I think a lot of them are going to expect that you know that if they say I graduated from Lamar High School and a public service endorsement and now I'm going to law, that you know what that means. I think that's an expectation.
Anything else y'all would like to add about House Bill 5 before we move on? Okay, we're going to kind of transition into 60 by 30. So Dr. Peebles, can you kind of just tell us a little bit more about the 60 by 30 plan, its goals and implementation?
Sure. So how many of you are familiar with closing the gaps? Okay. Well, you should be. I mean, unless you just got here last week or something. So closing the gaps was the previous 15-year higher education strategic plan, and 60 by 30 is the next higher education strategic plan, of which we now have 14 years left, or close to it anyway, in order to make this succeed. And the previous plan focused a lot on access. Okay, participation was one of the major goals of it, and that was to increase access, which was, by all accounts, successful. Goals were met and exceeded, and in fact, the goals were actually, as I understand it, the goals were actually ratcheted upward over the 15 years, so that the ending goal was not the same as the beginning goal. It was actually higher, and those things were met. The graduation goals were almost met. You know, the odd part about this is if there hadn't been a booming economy at one point, we probably would have met it. The recession didn't come soon enough to help us get over the hump with that. And for those of you in community colleges, you know what I'm talking about. So it's all, enrollment's always counter-cyclical to the business cycle. Okay, you go into a recession, enrollment goes up. You go into an economic boom, enrollment goes down. So, but the next higher education plan deals more with completion than it does with access. And there are 4 major goals to it, and one is the first goal, which was where the overall plan gets its name from, 60 by 30, and that is that by the year 2030, 60% of all Texans, and a Texan is defined as essentially as anybody living here. So, you know, those of us that are natives and don't really think anybody else is a Texan that's not a native, we'd like to give that up for this. So by the year 2030, 60% of all Texans aged 25 to 34-year-old will have a credential of some sort, a post-secondary credential of some sort. And that includes level 1, level 2 certificates, associate degrees, bachelor's degrees, and master's degrees. So this is a little bit of change from closing the gaps. Master's degrees were not included in closing the gaps, but increasingly a master's degree is the point of entry into the job market for a lot of occupations. So we're going to include master's degrees in this. And something that's little known but was also included in closing the gaps, this also includes folks who complete a board-approved continuing education certificate program, and those are programs of 360 contact hours or more. So for those folks who complete one of those, they're also included in that figure. This also includes anybody that we manage to import from outside. So to the extent that we can encourage in-migration into Texas and that they have some kind of post-secondary credential, they'll also be counted in that 60 by 30. And given the fact that Texas continues to grow, this can be important. So that's goal number 1. And goal number 2 is that by the year 2030, Texas institutions will be awarding 550,000 credentials in that year. Post-secondary credentials, the same scheme. And I should back up and say that 60% by 2030, the last data that we have on this indicates that we are now at 40%. So that's a 20-point increase in 14 years. And I think we all think that's pretty ambitious, but doable nevertheless. And right now, in terms of that 550,000 by the year 2030, right now we're at about 280,000. And so that's 550,000 post-secondary credentials conferred by Texas institutions. And that includes public and private, both proprietary and nonprofit. So we also count everybody in Texas that awards some kind of post-secondary credential is included in that. So the third goal is the marketable skills goal. And this is the one for which there really is no measurement, at least not as far as I can tell, although people keep asking me, how are you going to measure that? I tell them, it beats me. I don't know how we're going to measure this. We are going to measure it in the sense that the goal is going to require every institution of higher education, a public institution of higher education, to determine what their marketable skills are that come out of their programs. And they can include extracurricular activities in this if they want to, but it's primarily directed at their certificate and degree programs. What kind of skills do people walk out of that with? And the idea is that students get degrees and they learn things in those degrees that they can actually take to the wonderful world of work, but they don't always really know what they are, and it's not always explicit to them. You know, I tell people that all of my degrees are in political science, but I took a lot of statistics along the way, and it occurred to me years later that one of the jobs I had when I was working my way through college was at a plastics plant, and we made trash bags. But the statistics that I learned in political science programs equipped me to go back to that plastics plant and run their quality control department. Quality control is all about sampling and drawing the appropriate inferences from the samples. So, I mean, I learned enough statistics to go do that and do it at probably almost any manufacturing plant in the United States. So I picked up a marketable skill that nobody told me that's what I was doing. So part of this is designed to make that more explicit for students. That includes both soft skills and hard skills. This started off as a goal to try to address what is it that students are learning in things like, English and history and the traditional sort of liberal arts degrees, but traditional humanities and social and behavioral sciences. I should point out, traditional liberal arts degrees would include all the sciences and math, by the way. So really the social and behavioral sciences and humanities, what are you picking up along the way that makes you marketable? Because part of what our own data shows us is that if you take a graduate in English and you take a graduate in engineering, in the first year after college, the engineer makes a lot more money. But by the 10th year, the English major is making just as much or more than the engineer is making. So, and we think that a lot of that is happening because students have learned how to apply what they learned in that English degree to the job market and make it pay off for them. So that's the third goal, is to try to identify these things and to also make it explicit, not only to students, but also to employers, what students have walked away with. And the last goal has to do with student debt, and that is that by the year 2030, the overall average of student debt in Texas will not exceed 60% of first-year wages. And this is a statewide average. It's a statewide average across occupations, a statewide average across students. That is roughly where we are at right now. So this is a goal that intends to maintain the status quo. And I've gotten a lot of questions when I present about the plan about, well, why you want to maintain the status quo? Well, there are a couple of reasons for this. Is that Texas already is well below the national average in terms of student debt. And so that's one reason. So in some respects, we're not that off, so to speak. And the other is that in spite of the fact that we're lower than the national average, the trajectory still seems to be ever upward with this. And so, part of, if your trajectory is upward, then maintaining the status quo might actually be a feasible and desirable goal to have. I told somebody several years ago about running that, he kept talking about, he's much younger than me, and he kept talking about getting faster and faster all the time. And I told him that, I'd reached that point in my life where all I was trying to do was not get any slower. Okay. And now I'm just trying to, slow the rate of decline. So, it's the way it goes. So sometimes actually maintaining the status quo might not be such a bad idea. I mean, the committee that worked on this and staff kind of arrived at the idea that maintaining the status quo was okay. Most importantly, though, the debt goal was also chosen to try to engender a lot of conversation about the cost of education, but more importantly, who pays for it. And what we've done is we've shifted education from being higher education from being a public good to more and more private good. And when it's a private good, then everybody's a consumer. You go to the store and you buy what you want. And then what naturally happens from that kind of viewpoint is that the cost of that then becomes more and more borne by the person who's actually buying the good. In this case, that's the student. But we will sort of look at this, and if your institutional targets for all of this are not enough to get the state where it needs to be, then we'll probably come back and say, okay, you guys, everybody needs to be a little more ambitious. Or, your institution, you're doing great, but for the slackers, y'all need to, ramp up a little bit and try to do more. So we will be looking at those kinds of things, and we have 5 and 10-year targets associated with this. So just like closing the gaps, we'll be monitoring this as we go along. And, it's one of those things where we can't do this without both 2- and 4-year schools being involved in this. There's no way to get there without it, and there's no way to get there without the support that we're going to need from K-12 to try to ensure that students are college ready. Whether they're starting college in the 9th grade or they're starting college in the 13th grade, they still need to be college ready to be successful in that. So we're going to depend on a lot on K-12 to help with that.
Thank you. So kind of building off what you kind of said at the end, what are the roles of the 2- and 4-year institutions of higher education in the implementation? We can open this up at the time.
Well, you mentioned marketable skills and cost. So just to address that briefly, one of the ways to reduce cost for a student, if not reducing tuition rates, would be to make good choices. So to have pathways and advising and whatever it takes for students to say, I know where I want to go and have these stepping stones to get there. These are the courses that I take towards my major, towards my certificate, towards that applied degree, towards that job. So it is a lot of responsibility on the advisement process, whether it's self-advising or they have an advisor that they can go to seek this kind of information. But that is where costs can be reduced and students can start earning those marketable skills towards a job. Whether they get a certificate, go to work and pay their way through university, that's one way, or whether they get that credential and go out into the workforce. Either way, making the appropriate choices will reduce their cost overall.
Wow. God, there's so many things I want to be able to say to that. I think part of the challenge that we're going to have is the push to have more and more people get some sort of credential means more and more people will be enrolling in our institutions, right? And so if there are more and more people enrolling, can you imagine how many, we all know, are not going to happen? Additional advisors are going to show up in your office when those enrollments increase, right? And when you have an enrollment increase, but without resource matching that, that's essentially a budget cut, right? So how that may affect you is your role is going to mean you might have more students and less time to see them, which is a challenge for, I know, some of the, for example, especially two-year schools where you might have an office that has 5 or 6 counselors that are supposed to advise all of the thousands and thousands of students at your institution, right? So I can see that being a little bit of a challenge for those of you, not that I'm trying to paint a really bleak picture. There are ways, obviously, to help more students without more resources, but that I can see being part of the effect. But on a plus, right? We're trying to get more students credentialed. We're trying to get more students to get through the system, so to speak.
And I think one of the things for K-12 are connections and conversations. A lot of times we don't have a place to hand our students off to. We're not familiar with community college. We are, of course we are, but we don't have some direct connection. So the more that we can increase those conversations and those connections between high schools and community colleges and high schools in 4 years, that's really what our goal is to find ways to enhance those and make those more beneficial in the sense that more face-to-face, more direct connections is really the goal that we're after.
Yeah, I would agree. I would add that what that really means is that college readiness isn't on the backs of K through 12. College readiness is on the whole system, right? We shouldn't be in higher ed saying, well, it's up to, because I know, look, I work at a school that thinks really highly of itself, right? So obviously we're going to say at UT, well, how come the community colleges don't do a better job of preparing students, right? That's what the faculty might say. Or a community college or a four-year institution might say, how come K through 12 doesn't do a better job of preparing their students? But really the whole issue there is the students are all of ours from K through however long they stay in higher ed. So we all have a responsibility, I think, on that college readiness piece.
One other thing that I will add is back to the sense of accountability of the grown-up. I think a lot of our young people, whether in 8th or 9th grade, are depending on us. So we need to be accountable to them as they're making decisions, as we're making decisions for them. Because the choices that we offer do need to lead to jobs that can pay a living or better wage. So let's look inward at those offerings that we have. So as we're delivering and offering those 550,000 credentials, let them be ones that do give you a good job.
And I think that's important, but I think it's also important to realize that we're rapidly, I think, or maybe not rapidly, but we are edging ever closer to a system where we try to prepare a student for a job. And that occurs, I think, both at the K-12 level, but it also occurs at the college level as well, where the whole idea is to make you career ready. And I've often put it this way, that what we need to be doing, rather than preparing students for the career of a lifetime, we need to be preparing them for a lifetime of careers. Because what we know is that a lot of occupations that exist today, some of them we're not going to be here in 5 years. And some of them are not going to be here in 10 years or 15 years. And so we have this sort of two-pronged approach to this. I mean, one is that as Doris pointed out, we do need to prepare people for the ability to go to work and make a living wage. And we can't discount that completely, but at the same time, we also need to make sure that they're getting the kind of skills that they need to be adaptable to the changes that are going to occur in the workplace. And so, part of it is to make sure that we don't lose sight of both of those things that we need to do. And frankly, the push from business and industry is more and more about preparing a person for a job. And that's understandable from their end of it, because they need people who can go to work and do what they need them to do. But at the same time, we need to make sure that when that job that they are trained for today disappears in 5 years or so, that they can more easily make the adaptation to another career or to another job.
To kind of build on that, so there's this group that some of you are familiar with called the AAC&U, right? And in 2013, they do this survey every few years, and they survey employers all over the country. And they asked the employers a number of questions. And one of the questions they asked employers this last time was, does it matter what their major was? 93% of employers said, we don't care what their major is. They can major in anything, doesn't matter to us. But can they do certain things? Do they have a degree, but can they critically think? Can they problem solve? Can they quantitatively look at numbers and rationalize it on some level? Can they communicate? Can they be nice to their coworkers, right? Because if you can't get along with the people you work with, I don't care how good you are at the other stuff. These were the things that employers were saying across career fields. If you can do these things, we'll hire you. It's not about what major you have. And so I think we have to make sure, and I appreciate what Rex is saying, that the point of the undergraduate experience in higher ed is not to prepare you for a specific job. It is to provide you those skills that those employers just said on that survey, gee, we really wish all of our new hires had those skills.
And one of the things that we are working with students, whether they're getting an AA, an AS, BA, BS, whatever degree, is for them to be able to articulate what their marketable skills are. So, like you mentioned statistics, so for a student to be able to put on a resume, I learned these skills, I can do these things, and to be able to share that through an interview process or whatever it is that they're doing. So helping them to recognize what those are. And that really boosts their competitiveness, it boosts their confidence and the ability to get a number of jobs. But they may not know what those are. They may not recognize that that is a marketable skill.
Thank you. So we do want to open it up for audience questions in a few minutes, but how do you kind of see these two initiatives relating to each other?
I'll try. What we've all said several times is that they're connected because we all have the same kids. We all have the same students eventually. And I think that's what has to become out of all of this, is that we have to make sure that everyone is involved at every level. We need our community involved, of course our parents and our students, but also industry, our business folks, and all levels of education need to be involved. And I think that's how this comes together, is to make sure and ensure that that does happen.
Yeah, I think, I said before that it's going to require the K-12 sector to make 60 by 30 successful. And what it really comes down to is that we, in higher education, we don't have the ability, we don't have the resources to take a student who is at 0 and bring them up through a college degree. So we need students to come to us with something. And oftentimes, particularly community colleges, take students at some fairly low levels, so to speak, in terms of their learning and what have you, and can do an awful lot with that. I had a student once who started at the lowest level of developmental math, and eventually graduated from UT Austin with a master's degree in mathematics and a 4.0 average throughout the entire bachelor's and master's degree. And now the last time I heard from her, she was teaching math at a community college in California. So we can do an awful lot with an awful lot of people, but the better prepared students are, the more we can do with what we have. And the other thing I tell people about 60 by 30 is that even in 2030, if we look at all this and we've got the 550,000 and we've met the 60% and so forth, if all those graduates are unable to do anything and don't know anything when they graduate, then we have failed miserably. Okay? Because the truth of the matter is, if all we want to have is 550,000 graduates, we can do this in a couple of years. We just got to pass everybody who walks in the door. We'll have graduates coming out of our ears, none of whom will be able to get a job, at least after a while, because, for all of the known reasons and so forth. But all of that is going to require both everything from K through 20 to be working together to make that happen.
All right, well, thank you. I think we're going to do audience questions now. So Katie's going to come around with the mic, and any of you guys want to raise your hand with questions.
Danger.
Not all at once.
So if this 14-year-old decides they picked the wrong train, when can they get off? Do they have to park off and on lanes?
That's a very good question. There are provisions that allow a student to get off that train at any point. Of course, the goal is, like we said, the foundation only is a minimum standard for graduation, so we want them to stay on track to graduate with an endorsement. So at some point, at the end of their junior year, when a coherent sequence is 4 credits, so if at the end of their junior year they want to jump off, it's going to be really hard for them, difficult for them to earn an endorsement. So as a counselor, you would suggest this is what's going to happen if you jump off now. So there are options where they can change. They could change every year, but so long as they earn the 4 credits for that endorsement is what they're after. So an 8th grader coming in would choose an endorsement. At the end of their 9th grade year, they could change that endorsement. At the end of their 10th grade year, they could change. So really the goal is to get them an endorsement to graduate. And there's also provisions that allow coherent sequences to be, they don't have to be perfectly straight. It doesn't have to be 4 courses. So I can interchange some courses to make that endorsement still active for that student. Does that make sense?
Make substitutions, essentially?
Essentially, so long as they're in the same cluster, the same pathway. So there's provisions that allow 2 credits here and a credit here. So it doesn't have to be like what we would say a pure, I hate to use that word. So there's some provisions that allow students to fluctuate a little bit. So at 14, if they decide I don't want to do STEM anymore, I'd rather do public services, that could happen for a student.
I have a question following up on endorsements. So in a couple of years, we're now going to have students, many of whom are going to graduate with an endorsement in an area. What, if anything, are the 2 and 4-year colleges now doing to recognize, validate, address those? Because the incoming students are going to have an identity and an awareness of them. What, as a college, should you be doing with that endorsement information? You talked a little bit about it earlier, but I'd like to hear a little bit more.
So I can speak as to what UT Austin will probably do. They'll probably not even think much about it on the admissions end because the students can still choose what they want to pursue on their application for admission, right? So I don't know that we'll pay that much attention to it, at least in terms of how we get students into our institution, right? Whether or not the institution decides to reveal that information to advisors that are working with students, that hasn't even been discussed. So I have a gut feeling that we're really not going to do much with it unless the student tells us more about it. I do think that some of those endorsements are going to encourage more students to pick a major that is along the direction of those endorsements. Having said that, we know that at UT Austin, 66% of the students who pick a major change their mind. So again, we're not as worried about what box they start in, but rather that they end up in a box that they finish in. So that's kind of the point for us. And so it's helpful to know, and I don't mean to make it sound like this isn't a valuable thing, but I don't think that UT Austin is going to pay as much attention to it.
I think one of the things that, what you said earlier about prepare them for a lifetime of careers, is really kind of what the endorsements and really CTE is about, is getting them, showing them and exposing them to different areas is one thing, but also getting them prepared and giving them those skills, soft skills and some hard skills with certificates along the way is really the goal. Not necessarily that because I went through health sciences that I'm going to go into nursing or I'm going to be a doctor, but those skills I learned along the way are going to allow me to be ready for the next step.
So one of the things, the reasons I say that, is partly because for institutions we're legislated as to who we have to admit, right? Top 10%, for example, or in our case, we get to pick a percent. But basically, regardless of what they actually do in high school, regardless of test scores or grades or any of those kinds of things, we still have to admit them if they're in a certain percentage of their graduating class, right? So there could be a student who is, and we have plenty of these that are in their graduating class, they're 8th or 9%, but they're not really prepared to be at the institution. And so for us on the admissions end, we're going to worry less about these things because the state's already telling us we have to take these students anyway.
I think for the community college, two ways to address that. One, I think that students having had the experience of whatever endorsement they did for 4 years, they're going to be asking more specific questions of the advisor. They're going to say, I learned this, I did this, do you offer this? So I think you're going to see hopefully less undecided or less people saying, I don't know what I want to do, but more of, I did this, I didn't like it, I want to do something different, or I really enjoyed this, I'm very interested, I want to pursue this. So that's one response. The other is we are expanding dual credit in early college, high school at a very high rate. So we very much recognize and acknowledge the endorsement pathways because those are what are aligning with whatever we're offering as far as dual credit. So that's become and is becoming part of our language and terminology more and more.
So one thing I'll add is one of the things I love about higher ed is that we're trying to get students to see the world in these multiple relativistic ways, right? That there isn't an absolute right or a wrong answer, right? And what you'll find is that we don't all either agree as well on everything. So I'm a little biased in that I think every student should be undeclared, but that's just my own thing, and that's because I've worked with these students now for 12 years to see when they make a solid choice, they actually graduate at a higher rate than the ones that keep changing their minds. When we ask them to explore who they are and give them the freedom to do that, they own those decisions a lot better. They take more responsibility for their education. So that's just, and that's what I love about the fact that there's a panel instead of just one of us talking, is that you're going to get lots of opinions about different aspects of higher ed. And so this has been fun.
Well, I think that, and I'll go back to something I said earlier about this, and I must admit that I really don't, I learned more about the endorsements today than I have in numerous conversations before. And I talk to people from TEA on a fairly regular basis, and I don't remember ever getting the same answer twice in a row about what endorsements were. And I had one rather high-level person at TEA tell me one day that endorsements didn't actually have anything to do with careers. And I thought, well, hell, I thought that was what it was supposed to be all about. And I guess I just obviously missed the boat completely on that one. But I do think there's some connection, or at least there's supposed to be some connection, at least in the sense, one of the fears that I have, or not really a fear, but a concern that I have, is that if the endorsements, and I think this is a part of that ongoing conversation about college readiness, and particularly the alignment of curriculum between K through 12 and college, and that is that because I think what people don't often understand is that there's not often and necessarily clear pathways between some career and technical education and then what has traditionally been called academic education. And I always use the example of automotive stuff. Okay, I guess because I've been a shade tree mechanic since I was 15. But so I always use this. There's a path toward being an automotive mechanic, and there is a path toward being an automotive engineer. All right? Those are two different paths, and there is very little, if any, overlap between the two. Now, maybe back there in your 15 hours of gen ed, in your AAS degree in automotive mechanics, if you took the right courses, then you might be able to transfer them over into a path toward engineering. But that's about it. There is no clear pathway between one to the other. And so I think we need to be very careful with students as we go forward in constructing these things, that they understand that, we tend to talk about stackable credentials as though you can start anywhere and there's a clear pathway from that to a doctorate. And sometimes there are. I mean, the health sciences have probably done a better job of this. Outside of traditional academics, health sciences have probably done a better job of actually pointing out what those things are and constructing them. But we need to be very careful with students that there are endpoints to a lot of this. I mean, associate of applied science degrees as originally were conceived as terminal degrees in and of themselves. That was the end point. So, part of what we need to do is make sure students are also aware of these kinds of things. And I also agree about, I think it's unfortunate that we have taken a lot of the ability for students to explore more, I have an ongoing conversation with a good friend of mine about this, and he keeps saying, well, we need to loosen all this up so the students can spend more hours exploring, not less. Well, and to some extent, this is an institutional thing too. If you really think students ought to be allowed to explore, then create 6 hours of free electives in all of your degree plans and let them explore. Okay, but it is somewhat of a loss, and a lot of this depends on the major. If you get a major in engineering, you really do need to be taking an engineering course at least by your second semester, because if you're not, then you're already a semester behind in the program. Other disciplines are much more flexible than that, and I think that's really great. And that's another thing I think that where advising becomes so important in this, is that students sort of need to understand, because I'm really sympathetic to the idea that everybody should start as an undeclared and do something with that. But at the same time, that's really kind of tough, or it can be, depending on what they then decide to do with it. So, and that part of it is, for advisors, that's a really terribly important piece of this is, well, do you at least have some idea what you want to do? And if you think that's what you want to do, then this is where you need to start. And hey, you got a semester you can sort of mess around. You got a year you can kind of do this. But I think that's an important piece of it as well.
Guess we'll take the one last question.
Thank you. From a K-12 perspective, I guess it's more of a concern than a question, but I'd be interested in your responses to this. You all have talked a lot about the endorsements, and I appreciate that information getting out there, because sometimes in K-12 we feel like that's all we're doing is talking about endorsements, but that message hasn't necessarily gotten down below to elementary or up above to higher ed. So these conversations are important. But besides the endorsements themselves, there are some other changes to the graduation plans from House Bill 5 that are really important for you guys. And I think that this conversation needs to continue to the deans and to the department chairs, particularly in English and social studies. Because another thing that House Bill 5 did in English was it took away English core as an absolute requirement for every student. And instead, there's a list of like 15 different English classes that could be counted as that core English, including things like research and technical writing, creative writing, things like that. So it concerns me a little that that first level college instructor in English, which I know is a class everyone has to take, may be expecting students to come with a certain background in Brit Lit that they won't now have, because they will have never had that course. In social studies, another thing that House Bill 5 did was it reduced the required number of high school credits from 4 to 3. It used to be the case that students had to have government economics, U.S. history, world geography, and world history. Now they have made it so that students have to have world geography or world history, and districts decide which one of those they're going to offer. So again, you may be getting students that you're expecting them to have this basic understanding of world geography, but they've never had that course, or in world history, and they've never had that course. So the students that are first affected by House Bill 5 are sophomores right now. So in the fall of 2018, they're going to be with you guys. And so I guess it's really a concern that those plans are, are being put in place now for what that's going to look like for them. Because of course, one of our goals in K-12 is not only that they get into college, but that they can complete past that first year. We're looking at that data as well, and what we can do to help our students complete. Thank you.
I'm not sure if that was a question or a wonderful commentary, but I'm just going to go back to what I just recently said about our alignment work. So one of the great benefits of the alignment work was having to look deeply at House Bill 5 and look at what fourth year English options would look like. Where does government fit in? Where does world history? So we looked at that to the extent that we want to align what we offer for our students. I don't know that we really looked at it as far as, are you well prepared when you walk into a college history course or a college English course, because some students may not have had the traditional 4 years. So that, I don't think that conversation has been as deep as the first conversation.
I think we're more worried about the changes to math, given the belief right now that everybody should be an engineer or a computer scientist, because there's all those articles that tell you how much those majors make. Although I've never seen a major make money, I've seen people make money. But anyway, we're more worried about math. And where I'm worried about math is what I see a lot of institutions doing is saying, if you can't take calculus your first semester, then we're going to steer you in a different direction. And there's a real social justice problem there. We're going to create then majors for the wealthy white students and majors for the rest of the students. And those aren't going to lead to some of the same kinds of experiences or allow them to have some of the same doors that open. And so I'm more worried about the changes in terms of math preparation, but I've also been worried about just the disparity in any state, in a system where if a student by no choice of their own goes to a particular high school and comes out of that high school less math ready, and as a result are already behind in pursuing some of those majors. And so there's a real social justice problem there that I worry about.
So I hate to cut off the good conversation, but I think our time here is up.